how do we assess validity once we come up with our variables? Once we operationalize our variables, then we have to make sure that we are measuring what we think we're measuring, which is what measurement validity is. So a measure is valid, it is considered to have measurable validity if it measures what it is intended to measure. So are we measuring what we think we're measuring? So this kind of sounds like it's like a, well, no-brainer. Well, we're just going to measure what we want to measure then. But then when you start to delve into measurement validity, it's about, well, are you actually tapping into the thing that you say you're tapping into? And if you're not, then this is why I've got the dominoes here, because it's this domino effect. If you start with a measure that's not valid, it ruins like the rest of the study, because then any analyses you do and then conclusions that you come up with based on your analyses, they're all based on a measure that's actually not measuring the thing that you think it is. So there are 5 different ways that we can assess measurement validity. And this is through face validity, content validity, criterion validity, construct validity, and discriminant validity. So let's talk about starting off with kind of the most basic one, which is face validity. And this is just like what it sounds like, literally is something valid on its face. So does the measure just by looking at it, does it appear to measure the concept of interest? And so this is essentially whether or not it seems to obviously pertain to whatever the concept is that we think we're measuring. For example, if you ask someone what they had for dinner last night, that's not going to be a valid measure of their degree of social disorganization. Just that's not valid on its face. That's clearly not a measure of that. Even if you wanted to argue like, well, what you have for dinner is related to whether you're living in poverty or not, which is then related to whether you're in a socially disorganized, like, no, it's not valid on its face. So face validity is just sort of this first straight up, does it make sense that what you're saying you're measuring actually is what you're measuring? And I've got this little comic here of loyalty and enthusiasm are the 2 things I value most in an employee. You're hired. Well, that's kind of one of those things that, well, it sounds good, but when you look and see that he wants to hire a dog, that's not very valid on its face in terms of if he wants an actual human employee. So face validity is just, is it obviously measuring what you think it's measuring or not? And then content validity. So content validity is basically asking if the variable that you're coming up with covers the full range of that concept's meaning. So making sure you're incorporating all the important components of a concept in order to talk about the entirety of that concept. Because a lot of concepts have sort of a lot of things that go into them. And if you're only measuring this much of a concept, you can't then talk about the entire thing. So content validity is making sure we're measuring everything that relates to that thing we want to talk about. So let's go back to the social disorganization example. So social disorganization is, the theory basically says that it's related to crime and it has 3 elements. It's social disorganization is increased when there's higher levels of poverty, when there's higher levels of residential mobility, meaning people are moving in and out, and higher levels of population heterogeneity, meaning people are dissimilar and different languages, different cultures, different customs, things like that. And so the more of those 3 things that you have, the more social disorganization an area has, and the more crime you're going to see. And that would be Sean McKay's theory. So if we're trying to measure social disorganization then, asking about income would be a valid measure on its face because, okay, well, asking about income is going to tap into the poverty component of that. But that's not enough on its own. You would need to also include some measure of residential turnover, so things like asking about how many people move into the neighborhood every year. And then some measure of population heterogeneity, so asking for maybe the ethnicity of the people that you're talking to, which would then be compared across the neighborhood, let's say. So if you only have the measure for income, that's going to tap into social disorganization, but that's not enough to then say, well, if income is related, then that means social disorganization is related, because you're not covering the entirety of the concept. So, for example, in this picture, we're seeing some economic disadvantage, clearly, but we're not seeing any other aspects of the theory. So it's not enough to talk about social disorganization as a whole. And then we have criterion validity. And criterion validity is basically asking if scores that you get on one measure can and which is going to be your measure of interest, your variable of interest, if the scores that you get on that measure can be accurately compared to the scores that you get with a more direct or already validated measure of the same thing. So that criterion then, it's called criterion validity because the criterion is the gold standard of whatever it is you're trying to measure. And so you're basically going to compare what you're getting on your measure to that gold standard. And if it lines up, then that validates your measure, which you can then go off and use on its own without having to come back and compare it to the gold standard, which is great when you have the gold standard, but you don't always have it. Relatedly, sometimes there isn't a gold standard. So sometimes you don't have a criterion to compare anything to, or if there is, it's great, but you don't have access to it. So we can't always address criterion validity, but if you can, it's a really good way of validating your measure. So if, for example, you're trying to measure something like, let's go back to our example of anger, then you have a criterion to compare a self-report measure. So say your measure is a measure of self-report where they talk about their own level of anger, but you have a criterion to compare that to, which is some biological measure of anger like heart rate or testosterone production, let's say. If you have that for like a small subset of your sample and you can say, okay, when they're reporting high levels of anger, they're also having higher, faster heart rates and higher testosterone production at that moment. So that validates the fact that this is actually a good measure of when they're feeling angry. And so we can then take that and use it with a larger sample without needing that criterion, the biological measures for the criteria. But I mean, there isn't always a nice criterion like that. Like, what is the criterion for social disorganization? There really isn't one thing that says, yeah, there's social disorganization in this neighborhood, or no, there isn't. You have to kind of validate each measure on its own. So if you have a gold standard to compare it to, this is a great way to validate your measure. If you don't have that nice, beautiful gold standard, then to compare it to, then you can go to what's called construct validity and then sort of adding in discriminant validity as well. So construct validity is when you don't have that clear criterion or you don't have access to it. So you basically want to show that your measure, your variable, is related to a variety of other similar measures. So usually this would be something specified in theory or that has been supported in previous research. So, for example, if your measure is a measure of alcohol abuse, then research has shown that people who abuse alcohol have problems within their medical health has problems, they have legal problems, and they have family problems. So if you have a measure of alcohol abuse and you want to validate it, but there's no like gold standard criterion for alcohol abuse, then if you say, well, okay, if I'm actually tapping into alcohol abuse, then the people that are high on this measure should also have more medical problems, more legal problems, and more family problems. And if you validate it that way and say, okay, yeah, so it seems to be that everybody in, and again, you would do this with a small subset to sort of to validate your measure before moving to a larger sample. But you would say, okay, so the people that are scoring high on this variable are also scoring high on these other variables. So that supports the fact that I am tapping into what I think I'm tapping into. Because if I wasn't, then we might not see those same relationships. It's not like a for sure, but it's just extra support to say, because that would be what you would expect if you're measuring what you think you're measuring. So if we want to use construct validity, then it's sometimes good to then also use discriminant validity as sort of another level of we're supporting that this is the thing we think it is. So for discriminant validity, it's that same idea, but it comes at it from the opposite perspective, so that your variable, your measure, has to be related more strongly to other measures of the same thing compared to different measures or different variables that are related but measuring different concepts. So basically it's asking, is it more like that which it should be more like? So we take that same example of alcohol abuse. We know alcohol abuse is related to medical problems and legal problems and family problems. But we also know that alcohol abuse is a different variable, so it's not going to be 100% related. There's just going to be a relationship, but it's not going to be that every person that has alcohol abuse also has medical problems, also has legal problems, also has family problems. It'll be related. The likelihood will be higher, but those are all 4 distinct variables, 4 distinct areas. So in discriminant validity, we would take a measure of alcohol abuse that we want to use, compare it to another measure of alcohol abuse, and those two should be more closely related than if we compare to problems like in their medical, legal, or family problems. So discriminant validity is making sure that, looking at this Venn diagram here, that the things within over here, if we have multiple measures measuring alcohol abuse, those should be more closely related than if we cross over here and make comparisons sort of in this where they overlap. So they should have higher levels of relatedness within the same measure, or rather the different measures of the same concept, compared to trying to measure 2 related but distinct concepts. That's probably the most confusing one of all of them. So definitely let me know if you have questions about that, and I can clarify that a little more. So in addition to assessing for validity, we want to assess for reliability as well. And reliability basically means consistency. Does a measure or variable that we're using, does it give us consistent scores or observations? Now, we know from statistics that you're never going to have something where it's 100% the same, even if nothing has changed. There's always error. But reliability is basically making sure we have a certain level of consistency, that things aren't just random. And so reliability and validity are related in the sense that you have to have reliability in order for something to be valid. Valid measures have to be reliable, because if you think about it, if they're not consistent, then by definition, you're not always measuring what you think you're measuring, because there's some element of randomness to it beyond like your typical amount of error. But reliable measures are not necessarily valid, and here's why. You can have something that is consistent, but it's consistently wrong. So here's sort of a visual representation of this. So here's an example on the far left of where it's reliable, but it's not valid, because assuming we're aiming for the bullseye, it's clustered here, meaning that you're hitting all in about the same spot, but it's not around where we're aiming for. So that's going to be consistent, but it's not valid. So it's reliable, but not valid. And here's kind of where it's not valid and it's not reliable, because it's kind of a little all over the place. I mean, it's kind of around the bullseye, which is why it'd be like low validity and reliability. It's kind of, but especially compared to here where it's not reliable or valid at all. It's totally random. And this is kind of like, it's kind of, but here is where we have, it's reliable because it's consistent, it's within a small area, and it's valid because it's right around where we're aiming. So that's what we want in a measure. We want high levels of reliability and high levels of validity. But just sort of keep in mind how those two relate. So there are different types of reliability. So test-retest reliability is basically where you're measuring, you have 2 different measures at 2 different times, or rather the same measure at 2 different times, and you have a test at time 1 and a test at time 2, and you should basically get the same results if nothing has changed. And it's the same person taking the same test at 2 different times. If nothing has changed, you should get the same response. Then inter-item reliability, also known as internal consistency, is when you measure a concept with multiple items. So within the same survey, for example, you're asking different questions that should have the same answer if the measure is valid. So, somebody who condones one rape myth is very likely to condone other rape myths. And so if you have multiple questions and they're asking about that, if they're valid measures of how much somebody condones rape myths, they should be measuring consistently on all of those things. Then alternate forms reliability is where you're basically asking the same question in a different way. So you compare slightly different versions of the measure. So it could be within the same survey, or it could be a different follow-up survey. But you're asking things a little bit different to say, well, if you're still high on this measure, you should still be answering these in kind of a predictive way. And then we have inter-rater reliability, which means that if you have separate people observing or sort of taking the information down as the researcher or researcher assistants, then it should be the same or a similar rating across different people. So different people should be rating the same thing very close to the same way.